two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with my husband and comrade, Wayles Browne. He's a member of DSA, as I am. He is also the treasurer and newsletter editor of Amnesty International Ithaca. Today we will be talking about banned books. Wayles, what is the history of banning books?
Well, there's a long, long history. Back in ancient times, there were books, or there were writers, or there were historical figures who some authority or other tried to eradicate. There's an Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription where you can see that they rubbed out the name that was inside the cartouche. And if I remember right, it was Nefertiti's husband. The next regime had some reason to get rid of the memory of him. And certainly since the Middle Ages, there have been books that the church didn't want you to read. The Roman Catholic Church used to publish, until quite recently, used to publish a book called Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Prohibited Books. And that was a list of books that the church felt that no faithful person ought to read, sometimes because of religious differences, sometimes because the books seemed to be too sexy or devoted to the idea that the sun was the center of the solar system and not the earth. The church did eventually come around on that.
Do those prohibited books include translations of the Bible?
Some translations of the Bible. The Old Testament was mostly written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in Greek. There was a very early Greek translation of the Old Testament, and that was okay with all the churches. And there was a Latin translation of the whole thing, and that was okay with the Eastern Church and Western Church. But later, in Western Europe, there were various translations of the Bible into local languages, modern languages of the time. And those were definitely not okay with every church. The Catholic Church sometimes felt that if everybody could read the Bible in their own German language or their own French language or their own English language, that would undermine the authority of the church. And sometimes it really thought that there were points in the translation that didn't go along with their interpretation of religious doctrine. So some translators were ostracized, even executed. It happened to an English translator.
Who was that?
Tyndale.
And when was that?
1500s.
I didn't know about that.
So it could be dangerous to be a translator. And on the other hand, it could be very, very rewarding to be a translator. The early Armenian translators of the Bible were made saints. And so in Framingham, Massachusetts, there's a church dedicated to the holy translators of the Bible into Armenian.
Well, and there are Saints Cyril and Methodius.
That's right.
Who translated into Slavic.
That's right. They didn't translate the whole Bible, but they translated the Gospels and church books and lives of saints. So they themselves became saints, in fact, both in the Western Church and in the Orthodox churches. That didn't usually happen as late as they were. They were in the 800s.
But now this is getting into the translations that were accepted.
Yes.
I think we could come up to the present.
Okay. Well, there have been many instances of books being banned. I come from Boston, and maybe you've heard the expression banned in Boston, both about books and about plays. There was an American author who lived in France for a long time, Henry Miller, and he wrote a book called Tropic of Cancer. later Tropic of Capricorn, in English, but had to be published in France because publishers in the United States and England wouldn't touch it. In the 1930s, it seemed to be too obscene. He was banned in Boston. And Ulysses by James Joyce, the Irish writer, for a long time couldn't be imported into the US because the customs authorities thought it was too dirty. Actually, it's fairly hard to understand. You have to read it carefully to see if it is or not. Getting closer to the present day, the American Library Association, which is obviously a group of librarians in the US, noticed in 1982 that there were more and more instances where somebody would call on the library to take a book off its shelf. And so the American Library Association started up Banned Books Week. That was an annual week where they would publicize cases of books being maybe not prohibited, but at least challenged. Somebody would call upon the library, get this dirty book off your shelf. So every year since then, the American Library Association has designated a week, usually the end of September. This year it was the beginning of October, October 5th to 11th. And they would publish a list of the books that were most often challenged in the preceding year. So I can tell about what the librarians listed. Top 10 most challenged books of 2024. Number 1 is All Boys Aren't Blue. Number 2 is Gender Queer, a memoir by Maya Kobabe. So the first 2 are about gay and lesbian topics. The third, well, that's a tie between The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stefan Chbosky, which is also challenged to be as being sexually explicit, LGBT content, depiction of sexual assault, drug use, profanity, and that's tied with a much older book, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And that's claimed to be sexually explicit, but it's particularly objected to because it talks about a black kid wishing she was white, wishing she had blue eyes, which she obviously didn't, because she noticed the discrimination in society against people that had black eyes and dark skin. Toni Morrison, a Cornell alumnus, winner of the Nobel Prize, who would challenge a book like that? But they did. Number 5, Tricks by Ellen Hopkins, claimed to be sexually explicit. Tied for number 6, Looking for Alaska by John Green, claimed to be sexually explicit. Also number 6 on the American Library Association's list, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, claimed to be sexually explicit, also to contain profanity. These are generally books that have been challenged because they were on the shelves in school libraries. School libraries, somebody thought teenagers shouldn't read them. I think it would be very useful for teenagers to read books about gay people, read books about the position of black people in society, even read books about drug takers. I'd much rather teenagers would read these than that they wouldn't know anything about these topics in advance and have to explore them on their own hook. The American Library Association, as you can tell, is interested in cases where somebody has challenged a book that has demanded it should be taken off of the shelves in a school library or public library. From the newspaper stories, I had gathered that it was mainly parents who of school kids who wanted books off the shelves. But in fact, the statistics show it was government entities and school board members and school administrators that started up 72% of all demands to censor books in school and public libraries. And parents were only responsible in 16% of the cases. And 5% of the challenges were brought by individual library users. So what that meant is somebody told a school board, take this book off the shelves. And the school board was willing to try to do that in a large majority of the cases, but the librarians mostly didn't do it. The librarians mostly refused and often said, well, you haven't read the book. how do you know whether we should take it off the shelf or not?
So if they
Mhm.
haven't read the book, how do they find out that it ought to be taken off the shelves?
From what is described as pressure groups, often religious organizations, somebody begins to claim that a book is blasphemous or bad for teenagers or heretical, and the religious organizations, not all, thank God, some of them immediately grab on to a demand like that and start putting pressure on librarians. So the American Library Association is very naturally interested in counteracting threats against library books and threats against librarians. But there are other organizations that have also taken up Banned Books Week. One of them is Amnesty International. And that's a group that didn't start up to defend books, it started up to defend individuals that were being persecuted by authorities. So even now, when it starts an action for Banned Books Week, it doesn't mention the books so much, it mentions the authors that have been challenged or persecuted, journalists that have been the targets of threats, songwriters, bloggers. I was especially interested in that. We had an event on Tuesday, the 21st of October, so a bit after Banned Books Week itself, but that was the monthly meeting of Ithaca Amnesty International. And what we did was to invite people in to read aloud from their favorite banned books. And there was some overlap with Amnesty International USA's list of banned books. And let me tell you about Amnesty USA's banned books first, and then mention the ones that we read aloud. So Amnesty International USA picked out 7 individuals or cases. One of them was a blogger and revolutionary in Egypt, Alaa Abdel Fattah. But even before the week started, the president of Egypt pardoned him. After 6 years of imprisonment, he did get out of prison. Cases that are still relevant. Yashar is a Uyghur songwriter in the Uyghur region of China. He was put in prison for 3 years for creating songs in the Uyghur language, which the Chinese authorities have been repressing. If you even have Uyghur language books, you can be charged of promoting extremism. And they did that to him. And then there was a journalist in Myanmar who went to Rakhine State in Myanmar after a hurricane. That's called a cyclone in Asian countries. He went there in May 2023 and took pictures, being a photojournalist, of the hurricane damage. He was arrested, interrogated, beaten, and sentenced by a military tribunal to 20 years in prison at hard labor. Okay, so it can be dangerous to be a journalist if you report on things that your own government doesn't want reported on.
Like a hurricane.
They didn't mind saying there was a hurricane, but they did mind saying there was damage from the hurricane, and the government hasn't been working on cleaning it up. So that was the case on Theresa, Burmese Myanmar journalist. In Russia, there is a transgender man and LGBTQ activist named Marky Slitsyn, sentenced to 12 years for high treason against Russia. For what? Well, he sent $10 to a Ukrainian bank for a humanitarian charity. Said it was for humanitarian reasons. Well, he was tried for extremism. In Russia, you can be tried for extremism if you carry on LGBTI propaganda. He was doing that. He was a transgender man himself, but they said, well, officially you're a woman. We're going to send you to a woman's prison. So Amnesty International has been organizing petitions and letters in defense of Marky Slitsyn. Another case, even longer prison sentence, in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Nasser al-Ghamli, a retired teacher, was sentenced to death for his posts on X and YouTube criticizing the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia, called for the release of detained clerics. Clerics means Muslim priests. Later, his death sentence was commuted, but they sentenced him to 30 years in prison. So it's very dangerous in Saudi Arabia to post on social media. He is still in prison. Amnesty International has been sending in letters and petitions calling for him to be pardoned or released. In Tunisia, a lawyer and media personality named Sonia Dahmani, she defended people who criticized the government in Tunisia, appeared on radio and TV shows. Well, that's dangerous. She commented on racism and other political issues, like how bad the conditions are in prison, and now she's in prison herself ever since May 11th, 2024. And there's one that's sort of a mass case, not a single individual, calling upon the American government to stop the crackdown, as it says, protect students' rights to freedom of expression. Nobody should be threatened or detained, and in particular, nobody should be deported if they speak out for human rights. So this applies so far to foreign students in the United States who had their visas revoked and who were swallowed up by ICE and put in prisons or different detention sites and detained or threatened with being deported. Some have actually been sent away. Some have left the country on their own hook because they didn't feel safe here. So Amnesty International is using its tried and true methods and writing to the American government, writing to Kristi Noem, head of the Department of Homeland Security. Mm. And so we've been circulating a petition, Stop the Crackdown, gathering signatures. Amnesty International, when it starts a campaign, looks to international documents for support. And so working for the freedom of authors and bloggers and journalists and songwriters, it refers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations back in 1948, and largely authored by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of President Franklin Roosevelt, who was president during World War II. And Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which almost all the members of the United Nations signed up to back in 1948. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, to seek and receive and impart information. And it goes on to say you should be able to do this even across international borders. So you should be able to write books, publish newspapers, and later when blogs were invented, it's come to include blogs as well. You should be able to publish your opinion on blogs as well as in newspapers. And nobody should be able to interfere with that, certainly not governments.
So you plunged quite quickly after talking about the American Library Association beginning Banned Books Week into the role of Amnesty International. Is Amnesty International the only organization in Ithaca that celebrated
Banned Books Week? No, far from it. Ithaca City of Asylum has, at least in past years, organized events and public readings for Banned Books Week. And at Ithaca College, there is the Park Center for Independent Media. And they organized an event earlier in October. Censorship is so 1984. In conjunction with the Project Censored show, Project Censored, headed by Mickey Huff, who was head of that even before he became head of the Park School, the Park Institute for Independent Media, is now head of that as well, and held a very interesting session inviting 3 student filmmakers who just recently graduated from Ithaca College. One of the good things about Ithaca College is it teaches you how to make films. And and how to work in other media. Uh, so three filmmakers made a film about a call to ban books in at a Texas school by a Texas school board, and more broadly about a law in Texas about banning books. And they juxtaposed that with a preacher, a Protestant minister, who preached about the danger from uh, books, the danger that books could pose to teenagers and even grown-up parishioners. So a, a very intense short film using rapid intercutting between Texas uh, Texas schools, Texas school librarians who were challenged, and the preacher preaching about the danger from books. And they do like 20 seconds from one source and 23 seconds from another source, a quick back and forth, and much quicker than I would dare to do if I were making a film. I would want to see the entire context of one thing and then the entire context of another thing, but it was a very effective film.
I believe there was a recognition of Banned Books Week in at Cornell as well. But the only evidence I've been able to find is my own memory. I was postering about a Halloween party on Cornell. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not the party's not on Cornell campus, but the posters were for Cornell
You're
campus.
putting them up on the
I was
Cornell
putting them
campus, yeah.
up and saw an announcement on a different poster, but didn't really stop to make a note of it.
It's possible that you saw an earlier posting from the Cornell Library. They had a an exhibition, an in-person exhibition back in the 1990s, and an online exhibition based on that that's still available, um, about banning books and about books even by Cornell authors. Like Kurt Vonnegut had a connection with Cornell. He was on the staff of the Cornell Sun when he was a Cornell student. And and his book, Slaughterhouse Five, has been banned quite a lot around the country. Um, at the, the local Amnesty International reading to mark Banned Books Week, he had a reading from his preface to Slaughterhouse Five, uh, and also a reading from a letter that Kurt Vonnegut wrote to the head of a school board. Uh, uh, the head of the school board had called for uh, Kurt Vonnegut's book Slaughterhouse Five, which is an anti-war book about World War II, called not only for the book to be banned, but called for all 30 copies that had been handed out to students to be burned in the furnace of the school heating system. And so Kurt Vonnegut wrote a letter to the head of that school board. In the letter, he said, "This letter is going only to you, to tell you what I think of your attempt to burn my books." But later, Kurt Vonnegut distributed it more widely. So one of our members was able to get it and read it aloud. And a very effective letter. Um, I can imagine how an author feels if somebody not only bans but burns his books. That used to happen a lot in this country, and even earlier at the beginning of Nazi Germany. The incoming Nazi authorities burned a lot of books which they said were by Jewish authors or by decadent authors. They were very much down on decadence.
Well, I also, to bring this around perhaps to socialism for
You
this,
read, yes, you read at
um,
Ithaca Amnesty's International Reading. And who did you read?
Eugene Debs, not a book, but a speech. His speech in 1918 in Canton, Ohio, that landed him in prison for 10 years.
Yeah, because he was speaking against the war.
And let me also say that it occurred to me that another way in which people are prevented from reading books is purely economic. When wages are so low that people have to work not 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, but 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week. They simply
Have
have no,
multiple jobs,
yes,
yes.
they simply have no time to read.
Now, there's an old custom among factory workers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They choose one of the workers to not work, but read aloud from a book. While the other factory workers were making the widgets or uh, weaving the cloth or whatever they were doing. And uh, I'd be in favor of still doing that, but factory owners would probably repress that the way they repress union organizing.
Alas, probably. Well, thank you, Wayles Browne, for telling us about Banned Books Week and all forms of repression.
You can still read banned books. You don't have to only do it during banned books week.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.